welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. For those newly joining the program, my name is Irina, and I am the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. For all of us, the topic of energy remains a very central and important issue, regardless of whether we are in the field professionally or merely impacted by the fluctuation in prices, in inflation, in shortages, and in government policies. Where are we headed? How does climate change impact this area? Does it really impact the area? Are the fears of a looming climate crisis overblown? To discuss all of this, we have with us a renowned independent energy expert, Irina Slav, who many of you may know from her contributions to oilprice.com, as well as various podcasts, articles, and so forth. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Irina. Great to be here.
So before we delve into the substance of this broad and seemingly increasingly all-encompassing subject, could you tell us a little bit about yourself? How did you get into this field? What are you exploring specifically, and how is it that your outlook is significantly more skeptical than most people that are publicly speaking out on this issue?
Right. Well, I started writing about energy for a Bulgarian-based news company some years ago, and I was covering the oil and gas industry of Russia and the former Soviet Union. After I left this company and started freelancing, I got working for oilprice.com. And at the beginning, we covered mostly the oil and gas industry. I can't explain why I found it interesting. I was just drawn to it. It's a fundamental industry for the whole world and every economy, and each and every one of us. Initially, that was just it, oil and gas. But in the past few years, the energy transition has gained so much prominence that, it has become the new focus of my attention, particularly because I don't think that it's going to happen the way governments are planning it for various reasons, which I'm sure we'll discuss now with you.
Well, government planning of economies never quite works out the way it is intended, as we may know from various historical examples. But I actually want to delve back to a historical question of comparisons, because this is not the first industrial revolution. It's certainly not the first energy revolution or evolution, depending on how you look at it, that we've been going through. A major transition in the past has been from coal to oil and gas, and yet that particular period is not well studied in terms of the way it was managed, or was it managed? Was there that historically the same degree of publicity, concern, push, government involvement, and stakeholder kind of lobbying over that particular transitionary period compared to what we are undergoing now?
Right. I think the first industrial revolution and the transition from coal to liquid fuels and natural gas was more of an evolution. It happened organically. I'm certainly no expert on the historical perspective, but the way I see it from what I know is that it happened quite naturally. First, people discovered coal and how much energy it could produce, and then they discovered oil and gas and found out that they could pack even more energy, and then internal combustion engines appeared. All this happened sort of organically. It wasn't mandated by governments the way that governments in Europe and the US and Canada are trying to mandate. Well, they're not trying, they're mandating a switch from oil, gas, and coal to wind and solar and hydrogen, regardless of what what the market says works and doesn't work.
So the market obviously was smart enough to realize that oil and gas were more efficient, cleaner, and better for various reasons than coal. why is it that there is this set of conception that the market will not self-regulate in terms of what energy processes are more are better suited than others?
Right now, you mean?
Yes.
It's a very good question. It's a very uncomfortable question. I just read today an article in the Financial Times that quoted the chief executive of Ørsted, the Danish wind turbine maker, the biggest in the world, who was calling on the UK government to provide more financial support for the wind industry because it couldn't it couldn't draw in investors because the UK is the European Union is offering wind and solar producers the so-called contracts for difference aimed at locking in a fixed price for their electricity over a longer period of time. But this price is lower than what wind power companies like Ørsted need to draw investments for their new projects. Basically, the market is not saying that these forms of energy are competitive. And it's interesting because the International Energy Agency, the European Union, the British government, the Biden administration all try to convince us that wind and solar are much cheaper than oil and gas. But they're not on a market basis. They are only cheaper because of the massive subsidies that governments are doling out to these industries. If left on their own, they cannot compete, which is essentially what the CEO of Ørsted told the Financial Times. They can't do it on their own. They need more subsidies in order to make some return on their investment or even draw investors to build their projects.
I've looked at a number of countries which have shown a very robust level of government level support for wind and solar, including Japan, Canada, and a few others. And to my surprise, this sector's amount for a fraction of the overall energy consumption, with all the subsidies, with all the hype, with government support and regulations. How is that possible that there's such a disconnect between the actual numbers of what is being utilized versus the way it's being presented to the public as a major growing sector of the economy, if it's such actually a tiny amount of the actual energy consumption in those countries?
Well, that's because of the nature of wind and solar for starters, and most importantly to me, the fact is that they cannot produce electricity around the clock. The only sources of energy that could provide 24/7 electricity generation are nuclear, coal, oil and gas. This is not changing anytime soon. Solar only works when it's daylight and if it's not snowing too heavily and things like that. The wind doesn't blow all the time. So they do not generate electricity all the time. And where they don't generate electricity, they have to be, replaced by coal and gas. In Europe and the US, there's no oil used for electricity generation. So it's gas and coal. And of course, nuclear. There's a lot of talk about Germany achieved wind power accounting for 50% of generation on one day. And that's a big achievement for that day. But people don't need electricity one day a week or even a week out of a month. They need electricity constantly, all the time, literally all the time, which is where coal and gas and nuclear come in. There's a lot of talk about batteries. We're going to add battery storage and make them wind and solar, make them reliable. But battery storage is hugely expensive and it requires a lot of land that would come in addition to all the land that is required for all the wind and solar necessary to make the grid reliant overwhelmingly on them. And because this cannot happen on its own, it's not a good, it doesn't make economic sense. It doesn't make any kind of sense to me. This is why wind and solar, even if on certain days they account for so much of a country's energy consumption or production, overall they're still a fraction of what a country consumes and generates overall. And it's going to stay that way, I think.
So leaving aside, I'm going to get to the topic of greenhouse gases in a moment, but leaving that aside and just looking at the numbers and the relative success or lack thereof in the industry, it seems to me the discussion has been fundamentally dishonest on the success of these particular types of renewable energy. That's not to say that renewables as a whole do not have a future, but these particular types of renewables have been pushed far beyond their current capacity. And my question is, why have some in the renewable lines of research have been so much pushed above all other possible iterations, such as nuclear fusion, such as, well, literally anything else?
This is a difficult question. It's a question I've been asking myself for the past couple of years, ever since this climate change and renewable transition narrative really got loud. And the only way I can explain it is, first, there's a lot of vested interest. There are a lot of companies that stand to benefit from the transition, especially with regard to emissions reporting and tracking, which you said we'll discuss in a while. But there's also a lot of hype. It's a kind of a bubble, the way I see it. Investors are being told that wind and solar and hydrogen, green hydrogen, are the future. So give us our money and we'll make you more money. But all this is meeting the wall of reality. As I'm sure you know, BP and Shell recently, both two of the largest oil and gas companies in the world, made a U-turn on their wind and solar plans, because these projects in which they have been investing heavily, pushed by shareholders no less, are not providing the return on investment that was expected from them. This is why it makes me think that this is all a bubble, and it's going to burst. They're saying it doesn't work, so they're pulling back and going back to oil and gas, because there is a demand for energy and people will get this energy one way or another. And they are, they're hearing the street, you could say.
So essentially, what may have happened, and I'm not saying that it did, but it certainly, from the looks of it, seems highly likely that a certain set of companies with vested interests lobbied the government successfully once they realized that there is concern about climate change. The government decided to pick winners and choosers, as it usually happens in such instances. They did not necessarily look at the whole picture and at every possible competing interest in this area. They chose the ones who were either best at lobbying or had the most internal connections, or for whatever reason.
It's very likely. Yes, it's very likely. And then there's this whole really loud and massive activism when it comes to climate change. I'm inclined to suspect that there's a certain amount of business to that too, because all those activists and activist organizations are being funded by people.
Yes, nobody just goes into activism for free or lasts long there without funding funders to support the activity, even if they are ideologically inclined to do so. We've seen different streams of activism. The anti-fracking groups, as we've seen, have even foreign connections with Russia and Qatar, who are U.S. gas competitors. being the top-notch beneficiaries and infiltrators of these.
Yes, I've heard about that. Yes, they
Of
have
these
a vested
moments.
interest in yes,
Not
in activists against fracking. Yes, and there's this the follow this organization, the activist shareholder organization. I recently looked into their structure and how they actually work, and basically they operate on what are essentially donations, but they're framing it as shareholding. I mean, you and I can each buy one share in Shell, and we will be represented by follow this. We will not have a vote or anything. It's just one share. But follow this, which manages thousands and thousands of such individual single share shareholders, does get dividends when Shell distributes dividends. And it literally makes money from its activist shareholding. But it doesn't transfer these dividends to its individual shareholders, because how much is a dividend per one share? It's pennies. It uses this money to continue fighting the good fight, presumably. So there's that. And there are all those billionaire sponsors, donors to organizations such as Just Stop Oil, which are now actively engaged in vandalism against works of art and buildings and things that are gluing themselves to streets, disrupting traffic. This does not come cheap. And they do have some pretty rich donors. So yeah, I don't know what the donors get from it, honestly.
Well, they get PR, they get publicity, and you can't you put a number on that necessarily. But
oh yeah, they're fighting against climate change. You're right.
Exactly. Yeah. This is not necessarily the fight against the little guys against the big guys, or the good guys against the bad guys. It's a fight within the industry among different competing vested wealthy interests among people, and everyone else looking from outside in thinks that there is some sort of battle between good and evil, whereas it's a battle of corporate interests and
because that's how it's being framed. Yes, bad emissions, good emission reductionists, bad big oil, good wind and solar, and yeah, it's really kind of basic.
So this whole discussion has been effectively framed, reduced to very simple arguments that an average consumer who's not steeped in science or economics can grasp very quickly, and appeals to emotions. You're doing something good, you're saving planet Earth, and so forth. Meanwhile, we're seeing that the same people who are pushing these arguments don't necessarily follow their own trends, and I'm not even talking about the climate change summit jet setters, which is hilarious enough. I'm talking about something more fundamentally economic. You mentioned BP and Shell, but electric vehicles is another fine example, with GM claiming to be all in for EV engines, and instead putting in billions, something to the tune of $1 billion, into the regular combustion engines, and that news item was very much passed through the news cycles without attracting much attention or outrage. So how do these corporate giants manage to get away with investing billions, not $100 like an average consumer, but billions, and without generating finger pointing and name and shaming and so forth, whereas an average consumer not interested in transitioning or buying an EV is bombarded with all sorts of messaging on a daily basis and is shamed for using extra electricity and whatnot.
Well, because we make easy targets. Each and every one of us makes an easy target. I mean, if somebody points the finger at GM, wait, were you said you were all in on EVs? Why are you investing in internal combustion engines? And instead of asking this question, waiting for the rational answer, because we want to cover our bases, or because we know the EV revolution is not working, they can say, well, look at how much we're investing in EVs. I mean, we're all in on EVs. While if you point the finger at an individual consumer, you need to start using less electricity. You need to get off your car. You need to stop going on holiday by plane to a foreign country. You should walk more. You should cycle more. You should eat more, especially meat. You should stop eating meat. It's much easier. It's much easier to guilt individuals into changing their behavior, I think, from what I mean, lifetime experience.
But let's face it, there's been a huge amount of money thrown at corporations to change their behavior, whether through positive incentive or the other way around. I mean, I was just at an energy conference recently talking about US policy alone, not even the European Union or anyone else, and the Inflation Reduction Act and various other green energy types of
Right.
legislation passed by the current administration gave huge amounts of money that are supposed to trickle down through corporations to local partners and communities, and it's a fairly good incentive to change behavior. Money talks, but
Yeah.
what we are seeing is that despite all that money being available, it's still not being fully implemented, in part because no one knows how to do it exactly, and in part because I actually asked at the conference when one of the presenters who is very much in support of that legislation said, well, there's been actually no change in greenhouse gas as a result of all these efforts, and in fact they've actually risen significantly. So I asked then, why are you incentivizing this behavior if it doesn't really work? He said, well, just because it doesn't currently work doesn't mean we shouldn't do it.
Oh, I know. Just because the wind isn't blowing now doesn't mean we shouldn't build a lot more wind turbines. I actually saw this expressed as an opinion. It's the same kind of warp logic. Yeah. Just because it's not working now doesn't mean that it won't work at some point in the future.
Correct.
Yeah.
And basically, if you, I asked if you are a country such as India, rapidly developing, but with a huge population and various internal problems and concerns, why should you prioritize something like this over some other concerns such as, healthcare or just basic prosperity? And
Right.
he said, well, if we don't push people, then they'll never basically agree to it voluntarily, and
Really?
essentially just because we haven't gotten sufficient numbers of people somewhere externally, we should still do the right thing regardless. So I mean, and here's money to incentivize you to do the right thing on your own end, but that still doesn't answer the numbers question. And this is where we do talk about the greenhouse gas. If the data is in fact accurate, and despite all these activity, the greenhouse gases are rising, why should we be putting money into something that clearly doesn't work instead of exploring something that may work?
Yes, and adapting. That's an excellent point. My first thought is China. Look at China. China is the biggest producer of wind and solar energy. China has the biggest generation capacities in both wind and solar. It is also the biggest market for electric vehicles. China is still one of the biggest emitters in the world. And its emissions are growing because it is building more coal power plants, is using more and more oil, even though it is the biggest, the leader in wind, solar, and EVs. If China is not a case in point, I don't know which nation is, honestly.
Assuming that people are in fact committed to a cleaner environment, I just don't understand if they see that there's a correlation between current set of activity and a rise in greenhouse gases. That would seem to indicate that we are doing something wrong, and we should be looking into doing the opposite of what we're doing now, or at least shift the strategy. So that, and coupled with the fact that a lot of the practices involve relying on environmentally unfriendly actors such as China, and or processes that are not environmentally friendly, such as mining for raw
Yes.
materials for all these industries. To what extent is this whole concept of climate change really about reducing gases or any practical environmental effect, and to what extent is it a financial opportunity for particular interest or something else that maybe I'm not thinking about? Is it really about climate change?
I don't think it's about climate change. I think climate change is a very useful term that has become sort of a slogan similar to religious dogma. I really hate to refer to it this way, but it's an ideology, a very severe ideology, increasingly restrictive. You either agree that the climate is changing because of human activity, or you're a denialist, you're stupid, or you're a shill for the oil industry. And I think it's a mixture of two things. One part, activism and this religious belief that we need to save the planet by going fully wind and solar. And the other part, the much more important part, is that some businesses stand to benefit from this ideological drive, this religion. Just think about all the emission reporting that is making its way in the business world, and asset managers are planning to oblige, already obliging their clients and the companies they're invested in to report their emissions, to track them, to report them, and try to reduce them. Think of all the calls for scope 3 emissions, not just tracking your own emissions, but tracking the emissions along the supply chain. This is a lot of work, and companies cannot do it on their own. I've spoken to people in executive positions in various businesses, regardless of the industry. It's just not possible to do. That's a whole new workload, and it's massive, especially if the company is big. So we're seeing a new industry emerge, the industry of emission reporting consultants, developers of emission tracking software. Even the big guys are in on the game. IBM, Microsoft, they already have the tools, they already have the software to sell to companies that need to report their emissions. And the way I see it, it's a whole new business environment emerging, a whole new industry, or rather a set of industries that stand to benefit from this climate change ideology. Whether or not this will have an actual effect on human produced carbon dioxide emissions is a whole other question. Or carbon offsets, it's a new commodity. It's essentially a new commodity that you can trade. Emissions don't have to fall. You just buy carbon offsets. You just pay to some African country to keep a forest untouched because it's a carbon sink. It's a really clever way to make new business, to make new industries, and make money in new ways, to me.
But why the sudden panic over these emissions when we have transitioned from coal, which was far significantly damaging for the environment from any perspective, and we have been reducing our consumption? Why the sudden panic about a crisis? Where does a crisis come from if 100 years ago, when all we were doing is using coal and methane from horses, we didn't have a crisis, and now when we are no longer using those things, we do?
It's really complicated. I don't want to go into what still called conspiracy theories, but I've heard a lot of my readers on Substack say that one argument is that it's a wealth transfer thing, moving wealth creation from the hydrocarbons industry to new industries. Others say that it's about depopulation and centralized control over people, and consuming less energy because the planet apparently can't handle 8 billion people, which I think is untrue, because so many years ago there were forecasts that we'll die because the Earth can't handle 1 billion people, but it can. It does nicely, handling us all. To me, again, the truth is somewhere out there. There are people who probably genuinely believe that we need to use fewer resources, so we can be more harmonious with the nature and the planet we inhabit. And then there are other people who would like to control as many people as they can. I seriously suspect, from what I'm seeing from the European Union, which is where I happen to live, so I kind of have a look at it, and I've been following their energy policy. To me, it's a grab for power. It's about grab for increased centralization. The European Commission wants to have a greater say in pretty much everything, but especially energy policies, and the European as a whole with its agencies. These people who are at the helm of the European Union right now, I think they seem to believe they know better what's best for all of us. And obviously this is something familiar to me, having grown up in a totalitarian Bulgaria. This was the idea of the Soviet bloc by that the government, the centralized government, knows best what's good for each and every one underneath. This is what the European Union is doing. And I mentioned this in another podcast, and I attracted some hate. How dare I compare Brussels to communist Moscow? Well, I dare, because I've seen it.
Well,
as have a lot of Eastern European people. We've lived it.
speaking from practical reality, as someone with a background in law and policy, if you look at actual research papers submitted for review, you kind of get a closed cycle, because nobody just produces scientific research without funding. Whether it's a think tank, a corporation, or a university, you still need to meet financial. You need to be able to finance your activity. Otherwise, there's no incentive to do it, and there's no way to do it. So where does the funding come from? It comes from either the government, it comes from private donations, people who are interested in that particular thing. And if you look at the research, it can be affected by who funds it. And by the question you pose and the hypothesis you come up with, and within any scientific industry, and I'm not talking about energy, you can have shortcuts and people trying to push for the funding regardless of the actual scientific methodology being implemented. And I'm talking about type Ivy League universities, not just some, small state schools or whatever.
Right.
So my question is, how do we know? How does an average consumer who cannot follow the funding of every single paper on climate change or energy efficiency, what works or what doesn't, how can they discern where there is, a pure scientific, accurate tracking of data that can help them formulate their information about what's really going on and the dynamics, versus a process that has been corrupted by financial incentives from various stakeholders?
Right. I'm afraid there is no easy way to do that. Not without, following the news stream and being reading everything carefully, which few people can afford. People have to work. People have their lives to take care of. They can't, sit and read the news or watch the news and try to make their own conclusions. My only advice is to be skeptical about everything you hear. These are not my words. I'm paraphrasing someone much smarter than myself. I just forgot who. But somebody said that you shouldn't believe what you see, and definitely not believe what you hear. This is exactly the situation we are in. The corporate interest, financial interest, or ideological interest from governments or NGOs in the energy sphere, and not just the energy sphere, as you said, and they're funding research that panders to their talking points, to their ideas. And you can't know without in-depth research of your own whether this is true or false. And then the media usually simplifies every bit of research a lot to make it palatable for the general public. And sometimes even genuine research turns into something that it's not when it's covered by by the news agencies, like a battery breakthrough. There have been so many reports of battery breakthroughs. There are no battery breakthroughs. It's all in the lab. Just to give you an example, we're going to solve the battery storage problem because there have been breakthroughs in battery technology. Well, no, there have been some kind of breakthroughs, small breakthroughs in the lab. You have to bring it to market before you can speak about breakthrough. But they fuel these, these perceptions that wind and solar, when coupled with batteries, can do it, will be good. But it's not going to happen for decades. It's just one example from the energy field. So it's a bit hopeless when you're trying to find out where the truth really lies. But all of us get electricity bills every month. That it's enough to look at your electricity bill to get some idea if the government is doing its job the way it should, or there's something icky going on there.
I mean, as far as I can see, there's no real crisis. There is, an ongoing need to improve processes, which no one can argue with. We all want better, cleaner, cheaper, and so
Of
on and so
course.
forth. But because it's not necessarily a life and death crisis, the wiser way to do that is to experiment on small scale rather than stage massive and disastrous market experiments by letting these things play out in the market and see what works and what gets picked up and what needs to be adjusted. But that's not what we are seeing.
Exactly. There's this massive push for the adoption of alternative sources of energy. Rooftop solar, for example, makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense for people who can afford it and want to be independent from the grid, at least to a certain extent. We have a lot of this in Bulgaria, just houses who want to have their own power generation for the summer months. And when the sun is not shining, they switch to the grid, but they do save money on electricity in a way, or factories, for example, food factories, or greenhouses, plant greenhouses. So solar makes sense. Wind also makes sense on a certain scale, but pushing it in this massive way, not to mention green hydrogen, the huge hype with all those billions in supposed investments. And green hydrogen is produced through electrolysis by breaking down water using electricity produced from wind and solar sources. It's hugely expensive, it's hugely wasteful, it's a complicated process, and it's not efficient at all. As you say, it will be much better if we let the market decide which technology works and which doesn't, and also work on efficiency as much as we can. There is nothing wrong with using resources, energy resources, or any resources more efficiently. And this happens through a long-term process of educating people about it, about not being wasteful, which is not the same as what some activists have tried to promote, wartime style rationing, for example, or a ban on meat products in Cambridge. I think Cambridge University banned meat products or certain meats from its food outlets. This is not how you do it. No, you shouldn't force people into this. You could educate them, try to help them make better choices, but forcing is not the way. I think it's not the right way to me.
So we have seen that despite the best laid plans by governments and experts, there's been a number of geopolitical factors and disruptions that intervened with this transition paradise, which include but not limited to the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, the war in Ukraine, assorted other inflationary factors from internal economic management by various leading state economies and so forth, and all of them combined into essentially causing financial problems on a massive scale, to the point that people have turned away from buying EVs to the extent they were buying them previously, and and trying to save costs in whatever manner they could, buying fewer new cars in general, and looking for more efficient and cheaper processes. In a lot of this higher regulation is actually causing fewer people to engage in it. And we've seen coal plants open up for the first time in Germany, in in various other places. And so, what are we really accomplishing? How can we manage these, predictable but yet unpredicted um, externalities? And is transition, the renewable transition, in trouble because of them?
It is, yes, it is in trouble. The all these events that you mentioned, and the over reliance of the whole world on raw materials from, locations that are not exactly politically allied with the consuming countries. I think I've said it repeatedly in various posts and in podcasts. If the planners of the transition could just take a step back and think about what is realistically possible versus what they really, really want to do, it might benefit all of us. Instead of planning to have so many gigawatts in new solar power, for example, first try and do a cost-benefit analysis, and first check if you have all the workers that you will need to build that capacity before you proceed. It's not just about solar, it's about all of these technologies that have been selected as the only way forward. Stop being so negative about nuclear. I mean, there are countries that are not negative towards nuclear at all, but there are others who are very skeptical. Germany is a great case in point. They just don't want nuclear, and that's the end of it. They will hear no reason, they will hear no argument. They would rather restart coal plants than leave their nuclear power plants running. This goes against any kind of common sense, any kind of rationality, because nuclear is a carbon-free source of energy. It definitely has a place in a low-carbon energy world. It's things like that. I don't see enough realism. You see, I don't see enough rationality in the decisions that are being made.
So what we are seeing is to play on what you just said, the great energy leap forward, the great leap forward.
Oh yeah.
Previously did not work out so well for precisely the same reasons.
It could never work well. No,
But now,
neither can centralized decision making. Again, there's history says that it can't work, no matter how you try it. Yeah.
But there's something that's a bit mystifying to me. How did we all come to the conclusion that precisely the carbon emissions is the great environmental disaster we're waiting for, and not something else entirely? Because there are so many environmental factors that are important to human and generally biological habitat. And how did we arrive in the conclusion that carbon is this great thing that needs to be controlled?
I have a hypothesis about that. I'm testing it on a daily basis. You're right. To me, habitat destruction is an ecosystem destruction as a direct result of human activity. It is a lot more dangerous to all of us. But it's a bit more complicated. When you single out carbon dioxide, which does have a greenhouse effect when it released into the atmosphere, and it occurs naturally in the atmosphere, and this I think some people just zeroed in on it because it's simple. It's simple to say that carbon's bad. And I had this really funny encounter, this conversation with my daughter who's in grade 5, just finished grade 5, and they're learning about the atmosphere this year. And she was telling me that carbon dioxide is good for the planet. And I looked at her a bit shocked. What do you mean? Even I'm a skeptic. I know it's not a ultimate problem. I said, because without carbon dioxide, without it warming the planet, life on the planet wouldn't be possible. We have all, the older ones among us, who are, subjected to this irradiation with climate change narratives. We have forgotten that indeed life on Earth would not be possible if Earth wasn't warm. It's not just plant food, carbon dioxide. It is literally essential for life on Earth. Fifth graders are studying it. And just 5 years later, they get indoctrinated that carbon is actually a pollutant, which it isn't. Physically, it is not. It does not have harmful effects on the human organism in its normal, normal concentration in the air. And then there's the other thing: the Earth itself releases carbon dioxide. There were jokes around these recent volcano eruptions. The amount of carbon dioxide that a volcano spews out during a single eruption is huge. But are we shutting down volcanoes? No, because we can't. So this fixation on carbon dioxide was very convenient for this activist movement, this ideological, well-known religious movement, because it's easy to blame everything on it. Well, now they're branching into methane, which is an even more powerful greenhouse gas, and nitrogen. All these, political troubles in the Netherlands, and the farmers' protests were brought about by plans by the government to reduce considerably the use of nitrogen fertilizers, saying that they're bad for the environment.
But I have seen how that was also mismanaged in Sri Lanka. Shouldn't that be a lesson to Netherlands?
It should
Precisely that very same.
Yes. They dropped their fertilizers. They decided to go absolute zero, and this is what happened to them. But nobody's talking about this. You can't learn if you don't want to learn. And they really don't want to learn, those the people that are making the decisions. It's quite sad, but there's hope, I think, because more and more people are beginning to question this narrative, because they see it's not working. It's really as simple as that. You can see on a daily basis that it's not working. Yes, one day wind generates 50% of your total consumption, and then a week later it generates 10% of what it can generate. And this is publicly available information. There are websites where you can track the carbon intensity by energy source of every country in Europe and the North America, and I think other parts of the world as well. It's good that there's a lot more publicly available information that we can all use to be better informed about these issues.
My concern that all of this will end up like what happened with Alzheimer's research, which is that somebody produced an incorrect line of inquiry that monopolized the discussion for 20 years, and for 20 years, every other potential form of breakthroughs has been disregarded because only one line of inquiry was followed, and for 20 years, patients did not receive the care that they could have, precisely because all the research was single-mindedly focused in one direction. All the funding was going to that, and nothing else that questioned the doctrine was accepted in the academia. So only recently, when they decided that that whole thing had to be completely thrown out the window, did they start actually making real breakthroughs, because they stopped being blindsided by the one scientific theory that did not work and was incorrect. How do we ensure that we do get the scientific research and progress we deserve, the diversity of scientific inquiry into different potential renewable sectors that are not being managed to this extent that we are blinding ourselves by what is possible and what might be much better than what we have now.
Exactly. This is, I didn't know about this Alzheimer's research situation, but what you describe is exactly what we have in energy. The science is settled. Well, it's not settled because there are many scientists who question this, the argument, the theory that it's primarily human activity that's causing global warming. And some sane minds are saying that instead of energy transition, we should be focusing on adapting to the changing climate, because the climate always changes. The Earth's history has gone through several warming periods, several cooling periods, and the best chance we have for long-term survival is to adapt. By all means, look for more efficient sources of energy, for more, more environmentally friendly sources of energy, but do not focus solely on wind, solar, hydrogen, and EVs. Just, leave more avenues for scientific exploration. I don't know how we can make this happen, though. I don't know if, it's said that the science is settled and that's that. We will only be researching more of these topics, and we will not be funding anything outside these areas. It's discouraging, but I hope things change when, when it's proven that this cannot work the way it is planned. We need to change this plan. I'm a very big believer in adaptability, because that's how humankind has survived for all these thousands of years. We have adapted to our environment. Then we also started to shape our environment and damage our environment. Maybe now we need to remind ourselves that it will be a good idea to do some adapting again.
It's funny because the incentive system does not incentivize that approach. You have the EV industry is dominated by a few people with billions of money to spend. So if you are talking about funding into researching more efficient cars, and you have hybrid cars that are significantly that have many of the advantages of the electric cars without many of the disadvantages, but then you have Elon Musk or somebody of that sort who has the money to spend to push his product, and he has the political interest behind them because that's what they approve. How do you break through that and make the argument that some other industry deserves funding and support?
I really don't know. It will be up to the industry to make its case.
But
it's difficult.
We have this political collusion of private interests and public, government, government monopolies that have created this bubble that is very difficult for entrepreneurs to break through, and this is a real problem from economic perspective, from scientific perspective, from any perspective. When you have this domination of very specific monopolistic interests and versus the small guys looking at the alternative solutions. Actually, you could say that the alternative solutions are not exactly what is not being subsidized right now, or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Because they've selected this set of technologies, and that's that. We're not giving money for anything else. I think things will begin to change when people start feeling the drawbacks of this transition as envisioned right now. And when you start getting, by you, I mean governments, when they start getting a lot of people rather angry about their electricity bills, about their petrol prices, about their mobility options, and stuff like that, people will start getting angry. I believe in people. That we don't like to be put in discomfort. We don't like to experience discomfort if we're used to our comforts, and once they start getting taken away from us, we tend to react unfavorably. So I expect this to happen, and this hopefully will induce a change in thinking, and maybe open up new opportunities for research, for it could lead to the creation of new scenarios for the future.
Well, we are seeing some of this already backfire now, and in one of your articles, you've spoken about labor shortages that at some of these industries. On my end, in the United States, one of the facts is people are simply not trained, and there's not sufficient oversight to deal with the money being thrown into all of this. So you have a shortage of stakeholders who are able to cope and actually implement all of this on the ground. And on the other hand, you have self-interested parties, greedy for money, who are willing to sign up for anything but not necessarily implement it either and just mismanage it. And on the other side, you have governments that are still not moving away from the 2050 or whatever, carbon free goals, despite the fact that we are quickly approaching that number, and we are having all sorts of economic and other issues, and still they're fixated on those particular goals. I don't even know how they came up with them, but how do
they're
you
nice round numbers. I think that's the reason. 2030 is round, 2050 is round, and it's far enough to and don't forget the shortages of raw materials for the transition as well, and the opposition to mining.
So instead of being flexible, in light of all of these challenges and realities, they're still stuck on those goals and try to fix everything to fit that narrative instead of being flexible and say, okay, this is clearly not going well. We've just had a pandemic. We have a war. We have inflation. We have this political issue with China and African countries and mining access and raw materials. So why don't we maybe, make it a suggested goal instead of a mandatory goal or something like that, or direction, aspirational ideal as opposed to, so I don't see that
try
happening.
Something new. No, it's not happening. I'm mystified as well why this isn't happening. By all by pure logic, by common sense, it should be happening. If this is not working, let's try it another way, or let's try something new, because this is clearly not working because of so many reasons, lack of raw materials, lack of skilled workers. But it's not happening. Instead of being flexible, they're getting increasingly rigid about it. I have no explanation about that, really.
By the way, I also don't see the numbers of people going into these energy and environmental fields growing. In the US, I actually see a shortage of people going into science adjacent fields. People are going into all sorts of other fields that don't really make any money. This makes money. You can say it shouldn't be making as much money as it does, but it is good money. But people are just don't have the educational. There is a huge mismatch into what is being studied at universities and what is needed for these jobs to actually be implemented. So how is that demand going to be met, and how do you think all of this will be adjusted when, in 5, 7, 10 years from now, we just don't have enough people?
There will continue to be not enough people, because you can't force people to go into geology or petroleum engineering. We will still be needing petroleum engineers in 2050. Or in mining. Mining is critical to the energy transition, but people are not going into mining because mining has a bad reputation. It's as simple as that. And universities themselves are discouraging mining companies from promoting careers in the industry to students, from advertising mining engineering and related majors to students who haven't decided yet what they want to major in. They're being discouraged because they're considered a dirty industry, which is really ironic. The energy transition, the energy to so-called clean energy, the transition to so-called clean energy depends on this dirty mining industry. And again, as you say, there's no flexibility, at all
But
visible.
more than rigidity, there's also an inherent contradiction between the
Yes.
goals and the methods that they use to accomplish those goals.
Oh, yes.
If the goal is to transition to EVs, carbon free, whatever, then you need those sort of materials, and you need people who go and get them. So you can
Yeah.
always assign it to, abused human, workers in Congo or whatever. But that contradicts your human rights goals. It contradicts your environmental goals, and certainly really won't get you very far because it's not efficient. The slave labor is just not efficient at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So you're also not encouraging your own people to go into the field because it's dirty, but this is what's necessary for you to meet the goal. So this contradiction, I see something is going to have to give, and I'm trying to see which direction is it going to go. Are these universities going to realize that they have to encourage people to maybe find a more efficient way of mining and clean up house and make sure that human rights are not being violated and ensure the cleanest way of reaching their goals, or are they just going to continue until bad actors monopolize this and we become so dependent on other countries that our own economy collapses?
I'm afraid I see the second scenario is more likely, judging by the state of university policies in the US and to a large extent in Europe. They're quite liberal places, and as I said, for the liberal camp, mining is bad. But maybe I'm being unfair. There are so many universities.
Sure.
Maybe some will realize the benefit of training the next generation of mining engineers who would make mining less environmentally damaging, more efficient, getting out of the ground more with less. I don't know. I hope this happens.
I see no
But
reason for that not to happen in terms of scientific breakthroughs and technology. Some of it already exists, it just needs to be implemented. It's a little bit
yes, you
expensive.
need the people to implement it, and there are not enough people being trained to implement it. It's maybe the financial incentive will play a role. It usually plays a role if you can choose between a really well-paying job with a mining company versus a not so well-paying job with a, I don't know, logistics company. Maybe you'll choose to go into mining engineering. I don't know. We'll see. We
Yeah, the
certainly
problem
live
is
in
that
interesting times.
these problems are very long term. You can't train somebody
Yeah,
overnight to become an
true.
engineer, and certainly not everyone, out of all available possible people, not everyone will be a natural fit for that type of industry. And meanwhile, all this stuff happens on a daily basis, and we keep needing more and more people. And
Yeah.
so I can see that there's going to be a crisis. I can see that even if we sent 100,000 new engineers into the fields, which is not going to happen, it would still be, we would still be, kind of in a race against time. But that's, as I said, not going to happen. So we are facing a likely crisis, and we don't have the tools not because this is not predictable. We're just talking about it right now, but we're not
Right.
preparing for crisis. There's no preparation to how to meet a circumstance where we can no longer access those raw materials, or we don't have enough people, or there's a huge scandal over the conditions, or
Yes.
something
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah. And the transition advocates are making sure that the crisis will happen by pushing in the same direction instead of making a pause and considering other directions.
So we have
So I agree.
potential supply chain disruptions that will not just affect the energy environmental factor, because supply chains are always about more than just one thing. They produce a number of
Yeah.
items, and many fields are going to be affected by any supply chain disruptions, not just, and this is something that can be planned for. I had a discussion a couple of weeks ago with someone who predicted a pandemic in 2005, which would have given sufficient time for governments to do what they needed to,
Right.
at the very least, bring essential industries up to speed where they could be easily accessible. None of that happened despite the public warnings. Now I think we need to be talking about this supply chain crisis in the energy and environmental fields. because I think it's coming, and I think it's going
It
to
is
be
coming.
equally catastrophic, at least economically, if not otherwise.
Well, unless these renewable energy targets are reconsidered, it's going to be bad. It's going to be really bad. Yes.
To end on a positive note, do you see any indications of something that is promising in any area, whether it is some governments adopting an innovative approach, some industries emerging that I think are promising and positive things for the future, or some movements that hope to create a more balanced approach to all these factors: energy security, energy access, and of course, environmental access and environmental standards and economic needs.
Well, I think one good sign is this pivot of BP and Shell towards their core business. I think it's a good sign because the energy industry, the oil and gas industry, is saying loud and clear this is not working, which should make a lot of investors think about their future plans. I see it as a good sign that I see more and more people questioning this dominant narrative that the energy transition in the form that is being planned is the only way forward and there are no alternative paths. I see a lot of people suggesting that there are alternative paths and we just need to consider them. It's a very good sign that more and more people are, becoming engaged with the topic. It's actually a great thing because more people will be able to make informed decisions and with regard to their own energy future and the energy future of their nations as voters and as professionals in any capacity really. So there is hope. I believe in human nature. It will. I hope it will prevail.
Well, thank you so much, because this was very thought-provoking as always. I hope people listen to it and reconsider not their commitment to better environment, to cleaner, more efficient energy, but their commitment to dogmas and misrepresentations and cliches coming in from all the wrong sources. Uh,
Yeah.
I think
And
I
don't
think
believe alarmist language.
exactly. I think people should be open-minded, intellectually rigorous, and not believe everything they think, or everything they think they know, or everything they or everything they trust. I think there should be less trust, more questioning, more
Yes,
scientific rigor, and
absolutely.
and certainly more testing and healthy experimentation and analysis of what's going on. Just do the right thing, but do it with a critical mind. Don't just do what you think
I
is
agree.
right. It may not
I
work.
agree. I agree.
Thank you to everyone who's watching us. We'll be back next week, Tuesday night at 9 p.m. As always, this was the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio, and have a good night. I hope you enjoyed this thought-provoking discussion, or at least enjoyed might not be the right word. At least you took away something that will cause you to think, to engage, to find out more, and to continue watching this very interesting issue.